Welcome to the second episode of the podcast series When Machine Learning Meets Data Privacy. Today, the episode will be about privacy regulations. Data privacy is a trending topic, since the understanding that the collection of consumer data is crucial for modern businesses came also the awareness that data can tell much more than we want about us. Due to this, many are the regulations that are nowadays enforcing data privacy, such as GDPR, CCPA, LGBT, and the list goes on. But after all, what are they saying about data privacy? What is the definition of data privacy, and what should organizations comply with? To answer these questions, I have invited Cat Coode, a specialist in data privacy and regulations that helps companies keeping themselves compliant with regulations. And as per usual, do not forget to subscribe our amazing MLOps community. Welcome, Kat. Thank you for being here with us today on our podcast about data privacy for machine learning for the MLOps community. Today, we count with your special presence on this episode. Yourself, you come from an engineering and software background, if I'm correct. I would like you to walk us through a bit. How have you jumped from a technical perspective to the regulation side and being an expert on data privacy?
That's great. Well, thank you first for having me. This is great. So, like you said, I started on the software and engineering side. I actually have a degree in computer and electrical engineering. So, I used to work for BlackBerry, which was RIM at the time, designing devices and servers. And BlackBerry, as a handheld device, was always security first. And everything we did, from the architecture of designing how the applications worked with the operating system, everything had a security first focus. And so I worked there for a long time, starting in development and senior management and architecture. And when I left BlackBerry, I wanted to help people understand data. I wanted people to have a better understanding of what they were putting into the internet, what they were putting into applications. Things had really just started up with Facebook and some of the Twitter, like all of the, obviously the social networks that we know today that are really big. But then a few years ago, the regulations started to get bigger, and a lot of the corporate companies that I was working with on cyber education came back and they're like, what do you know about this GDPR? And so I guess at one point in my life, I had wanted to be a lawyer, although I never went down that route. But I started getting into reading about the regulations, and I found them fascinating. So I did a certification in privacy law, and I realized a lot, which we'll talk about, is a lot of these privacy regulations. They come from both sides. They come from a legal side, but they also come from a technology side, and people don't always know how to implement the technology piece of it. So a lot of what I've been doing is helping people understand and companies understand how to apply regulations in their company and how to become compliant with those privacy regulations.
That's amazing. And very curious to see how like you jumped from, of course, your experience took you through this path, but it's very interesting how we see you jumping from a technical perspective towards something more related with regulations. Although, yeah, the perspective, as you mentioned, of having the regulations having both the in this case privacy having both the side of the regulations and the technical perspective is very interesting. I dare to ask you, how can we then define, having all these perspectives, how we can define data privacy on that sense?
Yeah, that's always a really hard question. And I get it a lot in cybersecurity circles. And people are like, what's the difference between security and privacy? So, security is protecting your assets, right? Security is protecting, keeping people out from where they don't belong. But privacy is keeping the information and the individuals safe. And unfortunately, the difference with security and privacy, I mean, people always use the castle analogies, but like with security, you've got a moat and you've got a big wall. And if someone gets in, you could probably kick them out again. But with privacy, is what is the king doing right now? If somebody finds out what the king is doing, once they know, they know. And so privacy to me is really critical because security, I mean, obviously security is also important, but from a privacy perspective, once the information's out there, the damage is done. There's no way to put it back in the box, right? You can't shove the toothpaste back in the toothpaste container. So it's really important that people prioritize privacy in addition to security, because if someone gets in only one time out of a million from a security perspective and a risk analysis, it's a low risk. But again, once the data is out there, the risk is already, the harm has been done for the individual.
Having in knowing this, do you think, and this might be too of an opinion, but do you think that current regulations and from the ones that you know, like GDPR and even CCPA, for example, do you think they do cover everything they need to in order to ensure, privacy? I think this is a bit of a wide scope. Of course, it probably is not even possible, but what's your opinion on this?
I do think they're a really good step in the right direction. So if anyone's listening isn't aware of all of this stuff, I mean, we've had things like NIST and ISO, which you hear about a lot in the security world, have been around for a long time, right? And they are, again, they're security focused. Um, so GDPR, which is European Union, CCPA, which is California, PEPIDA, which is what I have in Canada, all of these regulations are trying to put individuals first. So it's privacy, but it's always let's consider your user instead of let's consider how to innovate. Because I find, especially coming from a tech community and a tech background, there's this thing about innovation. We can innovate so quickly online these days. Like it's so easy to create a new app in a day that people aren't stopping to think about what the impact is on the individual who's using the app. And so I feel like these regulations are doing that well because they're putting the light back on the individual. So they're saying, whoa, before you design this, I know it's cool and it'll make you money, but what happens to your user and their data when they use this app?
And on that sense, and now that you mentioned that, I, at least from my perspective, and this might be a bit controversial, although these laws and regulations are saying that and are putting those concerns and putting the individual first, what happens in a lot of cases is that companies, especially maybe the smaller ones and the ones that are a bit more disrupting, are not taking the regulations at least so serious. It seems like conceptually these laws seems only to apply to bigger organizations, or it seems like the market is doing that. At least I don't know what is your perspective on that.
No, unfortunately, I tend to agree with you. I think we've got companies in the spotlight, big companies in the spotlight, where people saying, hey, you know what, you can't be in Europe right now if you're not GDPR compliant. And so they're doing that in order to maintain European customers. And then you've got new companies that are starting brand new and are trying to implement a lot of this privacy first thinking. But you're right. I agree. There's all sorts of small to medium businesses, which is the majority of what we use in the world, and those small to medium businesses, it costs money to implement regulations because often you have to go back and fix the things that are wrong. They don't have the time. So one way I kind of explain this is like if all the buildings had crumbling foundation and you needed to fix the foundation, which is what we're essentially doing by reapplying privacy, is the big office building that houses 1,000 people has to fix the foundation or they won't be able to rent any of their units because those companies are saying, hey, you have to do this. But the smaller companies are like, we don't have the money to fix the foundation right now. We just have to run our business. So hopefully it's fine. Hopefully it's not a problem. That is the feedback I get when I go into a company and I'm like, okay, you know what? Here's the 12 things you need to do for compliance, and here's the order and priority in which you need to do them. And they're like, yeah, we only have budget for one. So it's not a priority. It's not a priority for at least right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. But another thing that I feel, and this might be from a consumer perspective, I tend to see that this new generation is getting more and more aware and more concerned about the privacy and the use of their data. Do you feel like in the end it will have to be the consumers forcing companies to, well, adopt privacy in order to not be canceled?
I think so. I think people, and again, we've become so complacent with a lot of these social networks that people are used to using and the amount of data. Like if you look at TikTok, TikTok takes so much of your data. There's a whole generation of people who just love it because it's fun. They don't want to know. Like it's like an out of sight, out of mind thing. I don't want to know what it's taking because it's too much fun. But I agree. I think as people become more aware of privacy and other options come up, I think as there are options to say, you could use this product, which will protect your privacy. Like you see people picking Brave as a browser or Signal as a texting app. So there, as soon as choices become present, I think people are going to move towards that for sure.
Now, a situation related with machine learning and even how companies, the ones that are investing in AI, how does this regulation can be framed in the context of data collection? Because I guess that's one of the major questions, or at least that a lot of companies don't think about when, for example, setting up their data collection pipelines or even their data strategy.
That's a lot to unpack. So, I mean, one of the main principles behind all of this is data classification, and that is always to me the first step that all companies should be taking is to list all of the data that they're collecting, and then classify that data into whether it is personal information or personally identifiable information. If it's identifiable information, if it's anything that you can use to identify an individual in a single piece of information or a combination of information, that information has to be protected. And so, in some ways, technology is great because you could use techniques to anonymize info. So that's great, right? So you could say, look, I've got 17 data points on an individual and four of them are identifiable. And if I strip them out, then I still have 13 great data points. And then that way they don't connect to anyone. And then that information could be fed into things like machine learning and algorithms. But you have to pull that personal information out because as soon as you start sticking that in there, again, it has to be protected. You have to ensure that it's being processed in a way that individuals have consented to allow their information to be processed that way. All of these regulations apply basically to identifiable information, and as soon as you can change that, then everything just becomes easier because it's not sensitive anymore and it's not private.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Another question that I have, and this is a bit related with a study that exists in this about sensitive information. If I'm not mistaken, that study says that in the US, although you might be hiding, for example, the age, the name of the person, if the sex of the person, you can still identify that person based on other few informations that person has, such as, for example, postal code and the combination of any other thing about that person. So let's imagine that in that case we have removed all of that with, for example, exception of a postal code. Is that possible for us to understand in an automated way that we really are privacy compliant when we just left the postal code, but it's still possible to re-identify someone?
Yeah, so the argument is if you can re-identify them in any kind of way, shape, or form, then it's not anonymous. I had that question once where someone was like, "What if I have four anonymous tables, but when I combine them, then I can re-identify someone?" I'm like, "Then they're not anonymous." If by definition you've pulled that data out, there should be no way to reverse it in any way to identify an individual. But what you hit the nail on the head, which I love, is people are always trying to automate this stuff, and there are amazing tools out there. Don't get me wrong, especially for big companies that will pull personal information and try and classify it for you. But that is a perfect example with this postal code of how it's situational. If you are dealing with a rural community where it's possible that there's literally a house at that postal code, then like you just said, you've potentially identified that individual. So if you said man or woman, like you said, the gender is usually not identifiable. But if you said man or woman at this postal code, and in that particular house there was only one man or only one woman, then you have identified them. Then suddenly postal code is not obscure enough to make an anonymous data set. You really have to look at the context of your information. A great example I use often is there was a high school in British Columbia here in Canada where they had been using gender because it wasn't identifiable. And then one of the children at that school now identifies as non binary as a gender. And so where it would have said, hey, here are the grade 12 chemistry marks for the average for girls, the average for boys, and the average for non binary. All of a sudden, that's not an anonymous data set anymore. You know exactly the individual that's referring to. So we have to consider the size of the data set. I mean, there's a lot of things to look at, but is that information really anonymized?
So, in a sense, and as you said, it's not, well, automation in machine learning in this case to identify eventual PII information can be used, but not everything it is possible to, like, it's not a recipe, at least the sense that I get from. It's not like there is a script that tells you PII information is this sort of field. So there are always the contextual information that you can extract from an external database that can make your data, well, not private anymore. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right.
So,
It can exist together, but yeah.
okay, so in a nutshell, let's say that organizations are still being able to collect data, being compliant as long they take in consideration all of this. Is that correct?
Yeah, so first you have to say I'm only collecting the data I require. That's a legal basis. This is the data I require to do what I do. This is not extra demographic data or extra other data. I'm only taking the data I actually need. Then you're asking your user for consent to collect and process that data so they're aware that that data is being used. And then when you do use the data, you're ensuring that when possible, you've anonymized the data. So if you were collecting, like if you're a doctor's office and you have to collect health data in order to serve your patient, then yes, you need access to that personal information and it has to be identifiable. But if you're a hospital and you want to run some kind of learning or something on symptoms, or you're trying to run an algorithm somewhere in the background to better understand, what's happening with this particular symptom and this, like with COVID, then you have to find a way to anonymize the data, or the individual has to know that you're using the data for that purpose.
And now that you mentioned COVID, and it's a very, very good example. At least here in Portugal, we had this kind of a situation where people, researchers specifically, were asking access for COVID related data from patients. And there was this question where, in a matter of national security or urgency, the access to this kind of sensitive data should automatically approved because it's a matter more important than the privacy of an individual.
There's a gray area. So I know that's come up a lot. Like there's a gray area between where it benefits the greater good and your privacy. So, I mean, if you looked at it, if you could stop a disease from spreading, if you knew someone had a disease and you could stop it from killing other people by knowing they had the disease, then arguably it's more important to know that they have it. Like I'm looking at not even COVID, I'm looking like way back in time when people knew someone had the Black Plague, right? Like, but with COVID, like I look at it, like I had to go get my laptop fixed, so I had to go to the mall to do that, and they took my temperature before I could even go in the store, and it was unnerving. It was weird because I was standing in the middle of the mall, and so if I'd had a fever and they turned me away, anyone in that mall would have had that information. So from a privacy perspective, I didn't love that, but at the same time, it's for the greater good of the people in the store. That was the condition of getting into the store. So, workplaces are now sticking in thermometers or like infrared in order to get into the office in the morning. You have to check your temperature. So, yeah, there is a line where you can say, look, I appreciate that this is private information, but it's for the greater good. And so, understanding, of course, that someone has tested positive, pretty crucial for the health and well-being of others. So there is definitely a line in there. There's numerous lawyers that have written really good articles. So if you're in a position with your company where you're like, I don't know where this line is and I need to cross it or not cross it, there's some really great outlines of when you can publicly disclose information in relation to this kind of thing and when you need to keep it private. So like if an employee calls and says, I've got COVID, I'm not coming in, do you tell everyone else in the office why that person's not there, or do you have to protect their privacy and not tell anyone why they're not there?
Yeah, makes sense because if that person had contact with others, for example, that might be a situation where it could be good for the others to know and take measures. Well, a few years have passed from this since these regulations were out. GDPR is from 2018. We could expect that, so some organizations at least would have already maturity in what concerns data privacy and protection, especially the ones that are in a bit more of a spotlight regarding these topics. Do you feel like we have achieved that maturity, or we are still in that path? And what are the more usual errors when it comes to this subject?
I don't feel like we've hit that maturity. I think it's interesting that when CCPA came out, which was in 2020, companies weren't ready for it, even though most of those companies were serving European citizens and should have been GDPR compliant anyway. And CCPA is very much like GDPR. I think there's a scramble to check a lot of boxes. And the biggest issue I always see is, again, these regulations are coming down from a legal perspective. So GDPR, you're supposed to assign a data protection officer, and that data protection officer is supposed to oversee the implementation of the regulation. And often that DPO is a lawyer. And you can get some highly technical lawyers for sure. But there are elements in GDPR where, especially the bigger companies that I've worked with, I think the harder it is because they're siloed. So the lawyer will have to go to the development team and say to them, hey, have you implemented privacy by design? Or do you have encryption on transfer of information? Or have you anonymized data sets? And they have to rely on the development team to just say yes or no. And then that DPO is checking off a box. The issue is that for me, everyone has a role to play in this. Product managers who are designing products need to understand these regulations so that they're not designing products that take sensitive data or that take more data than you need. And then the development teams who are actually making tech products need the understanding of how best to protect that information and limit it, and again, encrypted or protected transfers and storage, and are you using real data in your tests? So they need to understand it. And then customer facing people need to understand it, because when the customer calls and says, hey, I'd like a copy of my data, everyone needs to be able to answer that properly with, are you a European citizen? Yes, that's under GDPR. I will get you a copy. And then finally, the CXO team needs to get this, because like I've said before, teams are not being given the resources they need. They're not being given the time or the budget to actually be able to implement the privacy stuff properly. The biggest problem I see is that one person is assigned responsibility for this. They're trying to basically herd cats, right? They're trying to get all these different organizations involved and to do their piece, and nobody really knows why or what they're supposed to do. Smaller companies I have seen are more successful with this maturity model because they're not as siloed and they usually have less product, right? So it's much easier for them to change a product, and you can get all of those stakeholders in one room and be like, here's why you need to do this, and they're all on board. But yeah, in a bigger company, it is very, very difficult to do this. And what I'm seeing is that we're getting bigger fines from the data protection authorities. And that might be what we need to push some of these bigger companies in the right direction. But it's a hard job for whoever's assigned that DPO role, because again, you have to get so many people involved to get this right.
Just as you said, doesn't sound like a one-person job, and especially when involving so big companies where you have this a lot of different products for a lot of different teams. So yeah, on that sense, and without incurring in the risk of entering in a kind of a checkbox, besides all that you have to expose, there are ways or tools or any method that can be used in order to measure the degree of privacy in organizations, for example, so organizations can become more conscious, let's say, conscious of the level they are.
I don't like, there's lots of tools out there. Unfortunately, there's no one way of doing this. So, like I mentioned, ISO is big with companies. It's international, right? ISO released a 27701, which is a privacy addendum to their security, their cybersecurity. That ISO is very GDPR like. Because GDPR is new and some companies have to be ISO compliant because that's the standard that they've set themselves to. There isn't like a real checklist for that, but I'm hoping. It's long. It's a really long thing too. I don't recommend it for reading unless you want to fall asleep. But if you look at it, like I said, it might be good for companies that are aiming for ISO to actually come and say, okay, well, now there's a privacy piece, so now I have a little more guidance, and then they could measure themselves that way. There is no such thing right now as a certification for GDPR. So if there's a company out there telling you they will certify you as GDPR compliant, that's a lie, because it doesn't exist. Whereas at some point, the ISO auditing will there you can't audit right now. You can just get like an addendum to 27,000. Once that auditing comes in, if that's what a company needs is, okay, I need to measure myself, then I think that might be the first standardized measurement. I had to come up with my own checklist. I have like a 14-page checklist I use with companies, because if you go online and you type in GDPR checklist, you could get 10 things. You could get like 10 checkboxes. Do you? And you could just say yes. And I'm like, no, it's not that simple. You can't, like I said, you can't just say, do you use privacy by design? Yes. Can you access a user's data? Yes. Okay, great. But can you access it under load? Can you access, like, how are you authenticating that user when they ask for their data? There's so many underlying questions to that checkbox that, yeah, that's my concern, is there's no real standardized way to measure it right now. People really need to go through, whoever your DPO is really needs to pull GDPR and actually go through the entire document. It is not a simple process. It's an important process, but it's not a one day check kind of thing.
It's not like just I woke up, I will be GDPR compliant and check all the boxes and that's it. So, and it makes me wonder in a sense, and this more related with the implementation of machine learning. Well, there are a lot of companies that are just collecting data for the sake of collecting because one day they might be needing it. You see, in that sense, it seems like it doesn't make much of a sense, or at least it's contradictory to what GDPR says or any other regulation that is similar, where you have to collect the data that you need and not for the sake of you one day you might need it. But for the process of doing machine learning, well, it is important for data science teams to have access to the more data as possible, let's say. Of course, this is not totally true. And in that sense, in your perspective, do you think that machine learning can still coexist with all this data privacy and all these regulations?
I It really depends on the data you're collecting and how you're using it. I totally understand the issue here. So, I mean, again, if you're specifically asking for a user's data and they know it's being used the way it's being used, I mean, if you look at Facebook, I mean, they're the worst, but they have the number of data points they have is insane. But their terms and conditions pretty much say if you're agreeing to use our free service, the payment for that service is that we are collecting all of this data about you. And so they've pretty much laid out everything they're collecting. Now, arguably, like you said, with GDPR, they don't have a legal basis. They don't have a real product reason to collect a lot of the data they're collecting. And so that's going to be the issue. I think with machine learning, what people are going to have to do is find better ways to make the data less identifiable. So again, and it really depends on your product and your service, but instead of postal code, can you use city? And instead of birth date, can you use age range? And like, so are there ways you can still make intuitive machine learning and say women aged 30 to 34 instead of this woman that was born on this date? um, then that's kind of the way we're going to have to go. But again, it depends on the data sets. Now, tend to be with machine learning, you have a really big data set, so you should be able to do that. But with a small data set with sensitive information, you have to be very careful not to have it be identifiable.
When thinking about, for example, in healthcare, especially when you are dealing with, for example, clinical trials data or something or very similar, and you provide to third parties, it's the same example you gave on the school. Well, it doesn't matter if you only have 100 persons and there is only one person with a very singular characteristic. So I totally get your point on this. Well, it was a very interesting conversation so far. And we have in this podcast this special part of the session, which is the open mic, where I usually like to us to our guests to share an experience as a professional deeply related with machine learning, and in your case, someone with a lot of expertise in the area of technology and data privacy. Could you share with us like an experience you had you think it's worthwhile sharing?
Oh, there's lots. There's lots. I think I know privacy as a foundation is a pain. I know that. And I know it costs money. One of the good examples I have from actually when I was working at BlackBerry years ago is I was on the original calendar code, and a lot of things in there were hard coded, like dates and how we did recurring appointments. There were a lot of hard coded elements in there. And because of that, we actually had daylight savings time hard coded. And I don't know if you remember, it was probably a good 14 years ago now, but daylight savings time changed. And because everything was hard coded, we had to go into 10 different old versions of code and update them. I was managing the team that had it. I was just I was a team lead, and I kept pleading with our managers and directors to fix the calendar code because we just kept band-aiding it. And so instead of taking apart a hill and rebuilding it, we kept turning it into a mountain, right? We would just, oh, well, that doesn't work, so let's add this new thing to fix it. Let's add this new thing to fix it. It was taking people forever to make changes to this code because it was a disaster. And we kept getting pushback from the company that we didn't have time to take it apart and rebuild it because we had to keep moving forward on the product. Fast forward a few years later, and I ended up the director of the team. And so I had the authority to do it. So we took it apart and we rebuilt it. It took more time and money to rebuild it years later than it would have obviously at the beginning. But once we did, it saved more time and money than we took to rebuild it. So again, I'm on the foundation. I use foundations of houses because it's the same thing. Nobody cares about the foundation of your house. You will never invite someone over and be like, oh, come check out the foundation of my house. It's really cool. You won't do that. You will be like, look at the new paint color I made and look at my new couch. It's the same thing with products. Nobody ever goes, look at how awesome my architecture is and how privacy by design is embedded in it. No one will do that. But what they will do is look at the cool features and look how awesome this product is and all the great things it does. So you kind of have to live it to know it, but spending the time and energy and money to fix your foundation today will come back to you later. If you don't have privacy at the base of the foundation of your product, it will be harder to maintain it. If you're collecting too much information, then you have to protect more information. If you don't have it encrypted on transfer, then you are more likely to get breached and have a privacy incident. So the risk of what it's going to cost you, whether it's next week or next year, is going to be higher than it would to take the time to get your development team to rip apart what's there and fix it and put a better foundation in. So again, easier to patch up and fix and tear down a wall today than it is to have a massive leak in your basement and your entire house collapses and now you have to rebuild the whole house. So I don't know how many analogies I can throw at you, but a lot of them. But the bottom line is I cannot stress enough that even though it's going to take time and money, it is worth fixing the privacy today. Privacy by Design, which was actually designed by Dr. Anne Kavukian, who is Canadian. She was an Ontario Privacy Commissioner. It is part of GDPR. It is in LGPD, which is Brazil's privacy regulation. It's at the base of a lot of privacy regulations. And basically, it's got 7 principles. And it essentially, if you walk through those 7 principles, you will ensure that your system has a privacy first foundation, and you will make sure that you're putting the individual first. And that, again, when it comes to being compliant or adding new features, you're adding new features on this tiny hill and not on a mountain, and you don't have to worry about the whole thing collapsing underneath you.
Yeah, I can get you on that. And well, hopefully companies will understand that will cost way more to have to change their whole architecture in the future, rather if they born or change right now to a more privacy oriented, especially in the cases where they leverage a lot on data. Kat, it was a pleasure to have you here. I bet our listeners will have enjoyed a lot our session as well. And for that reason, I would like to ask you, well, if they want you to contact you in any way because of privacy challenges they are facing, or even if their organizations want some help on this, how can they reach you out?
So I am Cat Code, Coode. You can find me on LinkedIn. I should be the only one. And you can also find me at catcode.com. So that's just CATCOODE.com.
Thanks, Kat. It was a pleasure to have you here. Take care.
It was a pleasure to be on. Thank you so very much.